and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the team to tonight's lecture. It's changed titles, so I've amended my notes here: climate risk, geopolitical risk, and insurance. And I'm super proud and delighted to have our former professor of business back in the house, Professor Raghavendra Rau. Before we start, you know the drill. If there's a fire alarm, please leave the hall calmly, as quickly as possible. There's 2 exits at the end of the hall. There will be people helping you to find the meeting point. And also, after the lecture, we'll have time for a Q&A. You can either raise your hand, there will be a microphone coming towards you, or if you prefer, you can scan the QR code either in the hall and submit the question. It will pop up here, or you can, if you're online, please scan the QR code on the bottom right corner of your screen. You can do that during the lecture if you want to, but we prefer to have them here at the end of the lecture. So Professor Rau was the Gresham Mercer School Memorial Professor of Business between 2022 and 2025. He is also the Sir Evelyn de Rothschild Professor of Finance at Cambridge Judge Business School and the President of the Financial Management Association, as well as the past President of the European Finance Association and a past editor of Financial Management. Professor Rau has held the Ambank Chair in Financial Services at the University Malaya in 2023-2024 and was awarded an honorary professorship at the University of Jordan. He's a founder and director of the Cambridge Centre for Alternative Finance, CCAF, and serves on the editorial boards of Management Science, the Journal of Corporate Finance, and the Journal of Banking Finance, among others. And I think this is where I should stop and leave you to deliver the lecture. Thank you very much.
So welcome, everybody. A pretty awful day. It was actually a perfect day to discuss climate. So what I'm going to talk about today is about the relationship between climate risk, geopolitical risk, and essentially all our financial institutions. So what is the relationship between climate and finance, effectively? And to do this, I'm going to start by introducing you to a couple of families. The names are all made up, but the situations are real. So the first one is basically a family called the Hendersons in a town called Happisburgh, Norfolk. For those of our international audience, that, as I originally thought, is not pronounced Happisburgh, right? So Happisburgh is a very old town. It is actually mentioned in the Domesday Book in 1086, and it is also on the coast of Norfolk, which is very, very close to Cambridge. It is about 800,000 years old of history has been found there, including the first stone tools found in the UK have been found right there. Anyway, it's a very pretty little town, something like this. Now, the interesting thing about this particular town is that it's on the Norfolk coast, and so this family, in 2008, the insurance premium was about £400 a year. In 2024, the renewal quote came in at £2,400, or in some cases, when they applied, it was denied entirely. Right? Some of you may be familiar with things like this happening with your own home insurance, but this was not extremely unusual. Interestingly, they had 0 claims filed, and the house was completely intact. Nothing had changed. It was just the insurance premium went up 300%. All right, now let's introduce a different group of people. Well, in this case, it's not quite anonymous because this is essentially me. Well, in my case, what happened was I put it in Preston because Preston was on the other side of the country from Happisburgh. But it turns out these guys, in September 2021, they had a fixed tariff with Avro Energy. And in October 2021, it turns out Avro collapsed, one of 29 suppliers that year. Right? Some of you may have had contract with Avro. And their monthly bill jumped from £85 a month to £190 a month, and 0 change in usage. Right? So the question I wanted to ask today is, what connects these two families? They're totally different parts of the country. They're 200 miles apart. Right? And one case has a family losing their insurance. The other one has a situation of losing the energy supplier. One's about weather and buildings. One is about gas markets and geopolitics. They're totally different markets. But it turns out that they have exactly the same underlying problem. And the problem they have is the way insurance is priced and the way, basically, what happens when how insurance is priced meets the fact that the risks these guys are taking are no longer independent of each other. So let me start by talking about how insurance contracts work. And this I call the magic of pooling, right? So imagine a situation where you have 7 houses in a village, relatively small village. So, and every year I toss a coin. Each coin corresponds to one particular house in the village. And so if the coin comes up head, the house unfortunately catches on fire. It comes on tails, there is 0 fire, right? It's just random chance. So anyway, the point about this is the fires don't know which houses have already caught on fire. So assuming the houses are reasonably far apart, some houses will burn, other ones don't. But the key is one house fire does not necessarily cause another house fire. I'll talk about correlation in house fires later in the lecture. But anyway, turns out it looks something like this. So what you have is a situation where suddenly, and random chance, 3 houses burn. Now, the insurance policy basically says, I'm going to insure a large number of houses, right, and collect all their premiums because the risks are independent of each other. With enough independent events, the outcome becomes completely predictable. The key is the insurance doesn't particularly know which house will burn, but they can estimate how many houses will burn with a reasonable level of confidence. Now, with 7 houses, this doesn't work. So, for example, if you take a small pool of policies, maybe 10 policies over here, we notice that there are some cases when you have a massive loss on a really big house. But if you have 1,000 policies, the amount of loss you're going to make, maybe you still have that one house, which is a big house burning up, but you have 1,000 policies. So the size of the total loss you're going to make is much smaller. The distribution converges to a much more reasonable distribution for an insurance company. This is not gambling, right? This is pure mathematics. The idea is as the pool becomes bigger and bigger, initially what you see is you see the high volatility. If you only have two possible houses in your policy, which you're insuring, there's a big chance you'll make a lot of money, but also a big chance that you lose a lot of money. But as you keep insuring more and more houses, it eventually comes in here, and eventually it's pretty predictable. That's the idea of insurance, basically predictable risk for a long time. But how does that actually happen? I mean, how do you start with a scenario where you have 2 or 3 houses burning, but how do you get to a completely predictable distribution? This is something called the law of large numbers, and we can show it using a simple example. Right? Let's suppose you're an insurance company, and you're insuring one house. Right? So you can be lucky, or you can be unlucky. The idea here is, if you're lucky, you just collect the premium. You don't actually pay out anything. If you're unlucky, you pay out. So what does that look like? Well, if you take a chunk, what you see is, one case, in step 1, what you see is, you're lucky, that's the arrow going up, and you just collect the premium. You don't actually have to pay out anything. You're unlucky, you go down. Now let's flip the coin again. What you see now are 3 outcomes. The first one at the top is you're lucky twice, right? So that means 2 years have passed, no fires have happened, you're totally fine. The second one says you're unlucky once, right? So once you're lucky, the second time you're unlucky, or the first time you're unlucky, but the second time you're lucky. And the final one, you're unlucky twice. So the idea here is how many ways are there to reach those 3 points? The highest point is only one way, you're lucky twice. The lowest point, you're unlucky twice, so only one way to reach that. But how to reach the middle? Well, there are 2 ways. You're lucky once, you're unlucky, or you're unlucky once, and then you're lucky. All right? Let's extend this to 3 steps. So you now have 3 years of policies. And similarly, you can say, how many ways are there you're lucky all the time? There's only one way. But you go to the second one, which is you're lucky twice and unlucky once, or unlucky once, lucky twice, and back and forth. So it turns out there are 3 ways to reach the center 2 dots and only 1 way to reach the last dot. Well, let's extend this again. As you see, the distribution over there is called Pascal's triangle, and you can see that there are 6 ways to reach the 1 dot right in the middle. There's only 1 way to reach the top, 1 way to reach the bottom, and then 4 in the middle, right? And you can keep extending this as you go along, and eventually you end up with a distribution that is very much like a normal distribution, right? So what you see is a situation where you simply have coin tosses, positive or negative, heads or tails, eventually ends up at something in a distribution where you can predict what is the probability that a particular house will burn or not in the entire distribution. You don't know which house, but you know the probability. Now, energy retail works on the same principle, right? Though it looks different, it works on exactly the same principle. The idea is that gas prices wobble month to month. Right? Some months they're up, some months they're down. But that's for the gas company, not for us. So what happens for us is that we get our contracts from the gas company at a fixed price. So we lock our rates in for the whole year. But the gas companies, the input is wobbly. So what does the gas company do? They buy in advance, and they buy wholesale. So they fix their prices as well, a process called hedging. And if they sell you the same contract at the fixed price, and if they've done a hedge really well, the input they get at the fixed price is a little lower than the output, which is what they're selling to you, at a different fixed price. So those numbers are pretty separated by a markup, and they're making money, right? So basically, they make a margin, a thin margin, because they're paying for the gas. They're selling you the gas. The margin is relatively thin, but it's predictable. You get a fixed price, you're happy, they're happy, right? So everybody's happy at the moment. Here, the idea is exactly the same thing. Those wobbles cancel out over time. Sometimes they're high, sometimes they're low, but again, you can be consistently lucky or not. That's the extremes of the distribution, not going to happen very often. It's mostly going to be in the middle, some years high, some years low. They cancel out over time, right? So what does the insurer, the energy seller do? Basically, they have predictable bills, they have a thin margin, and they keep everyone happy, right? So reasonably straightforward process. What's the common thing among both these examples? The common thing is very straightforward. Because the idea is, it's one very simple idea. That is, random variations cancel each other out over time when you put enough of them together, right? So this assumes that your house fire doesn't cause my house fire, especially if I'm in a completely different part of the country. Similarly, this month's gas prices will not dictate next month's gas prices for the same reason, right? That means, in other words, these risks are scattered both in time and in space, right? They're not occurring together. So the question I want to ask you is, what happens when that assumption does not work anymore, right? What happens if those risks become what we call correlated? And the easiest way to illustrate this is to use a dominoes example. You're going to shift away from coins and talk about dominoes. Imagine that you have a whole bunch of dominoes in different parts of the room. One domino gets knocked over, doesn't matter. Maybe it knocks over 1 or 2 neighbors, but really, most of the dominoes are completely unaffected. But if you have the dominoes in a line, you push one domino, every single domino goes down. Right? So the idea is you have the same dominoes. Right? They have the same probability of the initial push, but the outcome is completely different. And interestingly, it turns out that the dominoes need not be of the same size. This is, by the way, a video which I grabbed from YouTube, which shows this precise phenomenon. It's by Stephen Morris. I highly recommend his videos on YouTube. This is called geometric growth. And the way it works is very straightforward. Right? So what you see over here are a bunch of different dominoes, and every single domino is 1.5 times the size of the previous domino. The smallest domino is the one on the extreme left. The biggest domino is the one back there, which weighs over 100 pounds. So he's going to use that little domino, put it down there, and then walk over the biggest one, over 100 pounds, That's what we mean by correlated risk. And the problem is essentially, when you have a situation like this, a small trigger can have a very large effect when you eventually go on, right? So the key here is the bad thing which you're worried about is not happening more often, right? It just happens to everyone at the same time. To put that into context, what you have is, when you talk about independent risk, the dominoes are all over the place. That's the ideal for insurance, because I don't need to have a super thick buffer. But when you have correlated risk, for example, everybody building in a flood zone at the same time, what that's happening is one flood will hit every domino at the same time, right? That's the essence of the problem. Okay, so let's take an example of, again, insurance back in February 2020. For those of you who remember, there were 3 major storms that hit the UK at that time. The storms Kira, Dennis, and Jorge. What turns out was it's enormous amounts of flooding from South Wales to Yorkshire, right? And what happened here was the insurers faced thousands of claims simultaneously. How much? Turns out they paid £500 million in 3 weeks. Okay? This was not spread across the year. It was not spread across years. It was all concentrated in 1 month, right? Basically, they had reserves which would comfortably handle normal years, but they all got clobbered at exactly the same time. Okay? With energy, it was exactly the same thing. In autumn 2021, for those of us who remember that, basically, European gas prices quadrupled, right? And every energy supplier faced the same problem simultaneously, right? Well, a typical UK energy supplier hedges about 12 to 18 months ahead, right? But the problem with hedging is expensive because you're trying to lay off your risks on other people, so that's expensive. And the margins, as I pointed out a few minutes ago, are not very thick. They're pretty thin, razor thin, in fact. So what did smaller suppliers do? They don't have the money to hedge. So what they did was partially hedge. They bet that prices would stay within historical ranges, right? Life is not going to change very much, and history says this is how much the fluctuation is going to happen, so I'm just going to partially hedge, not completely because I don't have the money to fully hedge, right? Anyway, it turns out there was, because everyone faced the same problem at the same time, there was no diversification possible, right? And so what that meant was, if you think about, say, an energy supplier, well, you could say, okay, I'm making losses in one country. The other country, I'm making profits. I can offset one against the other. This you cannot do. Essentially, it was a very straightforward case. All the dominoes are falling at exactly the same time. Problem becomes worse because of that thin buffer, right? All industries in this area operate on very thin capital buffers, right? This is not greed, right? It's not stupidity. The point is, the market is competitive. You cannot afford to keep a very thick buffer. Because if you try to keep a very thick buffer, that's money which is just being tied up as a buffer. You're not making any money of it, which means your profits are going to be lower, which means, effectively, you're going to back down, right? So if your risks are truly independent, you don't need that thick buffer. You don't need a massive reserve. Right? But the problem is, if you have those thin buffers and you have correlated losses, you're bankrupt. So let's set this up for the arithmetic of failure, right? How do you work through this with an example? So let's say an insurer expects 100 claims per year at about 10,000 pounds each, okay? So if I'm an insurer, how much reserve should I keep? Well, I have 10,000 claims, 100 claims, 10,000 pounds per claim, 100 claims per year. That's £1 million. But I may add a 30% buffer, so I'm looking at 1.3 million pounds of reserves, right? Okay, but now go back to that triple storm example which we saw in 2020. What happens? Well, you have 400 claims arriving in 1 month, right? Well, what do you need? Each of those are for 10,000, so you need 4 million pounds immediately. Do you have the 4 million? No, you don't, right? You have 1.3 million. So if the next 3 years, nothing happens, you have the money, right? Because 1.3 per year is 4 million. But right now, you don't have that the 4 million pounds. What happens? Well, bankruptcy, right? You have 3 weeks before you go bankrupt. Effectively, all the buffers are set for independent risks, as you can see on the left-hand side. That means all the risks happen. The buffer is big enough to handle one claim, and then you're depending on the premiums to come in and fill in those, the gaps in your reserves. But if you have Storm Kira coming in, 500 million pounds in 1 week, your total annual claims is wiped out. All your reserves are wiped out in 1 week. Let's now go back to my situation when we had Avro Energy. Avro Energy had about 3 million pounds in assets. Right? So, and they had a lot of fixed price contracts. I know because I had one of those. Anyway, it turns out when the wholesale prices spiked, the obligations to customers like me were wildly exceeded by the ability to pay their suppliers. The orders of magnitude different. This is not a badly run company. It is a company which is terribly done. It is a very thinly capitalized company which was hit by a wall of correlated losses. You have to buy a lot of energy at very high prices, and you don't have the buffer to handle it. And that's why not just one company, not just Avro Energy, but 29 companies went bankrupt over that period. Right? Started with green and then went on. In my case, it turns out that I was very happy. I had this contract with Avro Energy, and I had a fixed price. I had locked in, very thoughtful. And then they went bankrupt, so I was transferred to Bulb. And then they went bankrupt, so I was transferred one more time to Octopus and eventually ended up paying 3 times what I was paying under Avro. And it was not a fixed price contract. That was, a floating price contract. So the problem here is, when we talk about climate, this is what climate does. It's not about bad weather. It's about correlated bad weather. That's the key difference between how climate's been happening in the past and how it's happening now, right? Essentially, it's not making weather worse. What it's doing is to make weather more synchronized, right? So the straightforward idea, right? I mean, the traditional assumption is a flood in Somerset is not the same as a flood in Yorkshire. They're totally different parts of the country. They're different weather systems. They're different river basins. They're different timing of events. Everything is different. They're totally independent of each other. But now what's happening? The jet stream is shifting. The persistent blocking patterns where the same weather hangs out over the entire UK for weeks at a time. It doesn't matter whether you're in Yorkshire or in Somerset, you're going to get lots of rain. Right? So rain is pretty much dumping everywhere the pattern covers. And we've all experienced this over the last few years. Your rain just basically stays because the patterns have shifted. There's meteorologists call those blocking patterns. These weather patterns that just stay in one place for weeks. And to go to globally, especially for international viewers, right? If you think about Europe, the worst drought in 500 years in 2022. China, there was the worst heat wave on record. In the American West, there was severe drought. You might think 3 completely different countries. These are completely unrelated stuff. It isn't. It turns out they're connected because of global atmospheric patterns. They're all connected to each other. And for an insurer, this is devastating. Right? Why? Because the whole point of geographic diversification is that a hurricane in Florida does not correlate with flooding in Germany. You would not imagine that the two are correlated with each other. But that's the whole point of climate change. It's creating correlations that did not occur before. All right. So, in this case, what can the insurer do? We talk about this, we read about this in the papers all the time. Insurers rely on what they call return periods. What is a return period? Well, you talk about 1 in a 100-year flood, right? We've all read that phrase in newspapers. That means it happens once per century on average. And you can price insurance around that, right? I mean, once in 100 years, that's that extreme bad luck scenario, and you can sort of price around that, right? Well, what happens if it happens every 20 years as a once in a 100-year flood, right? Or it happens 3 years in a row, Yorkshire from 2015 to 2020. Right? 3 years in a row, they had 1 in a 100-year floods. Right? Basically, the historical data which these insurers are relying on are not just incomplete, it's actually misleading. That climate that generated the data which insurers are using in the past no longer exists. And that's not the only risk which you have. It's also correlated with geopolitical risk. So geopolitical risk is a multiplier to climate risk. So Europe it got about 40% of its natural gas from one country, Russia. That's not 40% of risk nicely spread across hundreds of suppliers. It's 40% of supply in one actor who can turn off the tap, and who, in fact, tried to turn off the tap in several cases. Right? So when Russia basically invaded Ukraine, and Europe sanctioned Russian energy, the price spike was not local. It was not what we call gradual. Right? It hit every European country at the same time. So basically, that's correlation at the speed of news. Basically, one phone call between Putin and his energy minister, and all the dominoes fall from Lisbon to Helsinki. Okay. And so every supplier, every country, every household, the price spike hits. And this is getting worse. So the geopolitical landscape is changing. So let's look at the big picture here. What's been happening over the past decade? Well, there are 3 big overlapping trends. The first one is the rise of emerging powers. Right? Big ones, China, India, Brazil. Right? So there's lots of new competition for resources, for supply chains, for influence, things like that. Right? And all these emerging powers are developing into new centers of economic and political gravity. They're all jostling for influence in these different areas. Simultaneously, increasing military conflicts, right? And each conflict, in turn, disrupts energy, disrupts food, disrupts shipping. Examples, Ukraine, the Middle East right now, tensions in Asia-Pacific over countries like Taiwan, between Thailand and Malaysia, and of course, growing trade tensions. Trump's putting new tariffs every day. We don't know what's going on. But essentially, we have sanctions, we have export controls, we have reshoring. All of these are creating what we call a climate geopolitical feedback loop. And this is why this matters for today's lecture. It's not that these are just coexisting. It is that they're amplifying each other. They're working again. They're increasing the levels of correlation with each other. What does that mean? Let's start with some straightforward thing. Let's start with climate changing geopolitics. Right? Think about why you have geopolitical risk? Well, easy way to think about it is water. Right? If you think about water stress, there's a lot of conflicts going on. The Nile. Right? If Egypt builds a dam on the Nile, it affects all the countries which get their water from the Nile. Right? The Tigris Euphrates, the Indus, all of these. Right now, China is building a massive dam on the Brahmaputra River in its own borders, but that will affect all the water downstream in India. So essentially, because of the water stress, what happens? In many cases, you have crop failures. There's no water. So you're trying to grow your crops die. And people migrate, which in turn creates political instability in countries where the migrants are migrating to. If you think about Arctic melting, that's new resource competition. Well, we can now find stuff in Greenland, for example, or to take Trump's example, or across the Siberian permafrost in the Siberian plateaus. And that extreme weather strains your military and your humanitarian budget. How many people can you provide aid to? How many people can you, try to save? And in turn, we flip it around. The geopolitics also changes the climate. Right? Think about, for example, if you have a conflict between multiple countries. Emissions agreements like COP negotiations go on forever. Nobody has an interest in trying to negotiate a joint reduction in anything to do with the climate. Why? Because you're fighting with each other. Right? If you have a trade war and you're trying to transfer clean technology from one country to another, not going to happen. Right? America has pretty much blocked off the import of any kind of clean technology from China. It's not going to happen there. Right? Similarly, think about critical mineral supply chains. Sanctions are disrupting that across the board. Right? So, and finally, if you're going to spend money on your military, you're not spending money on climate adaptation. So, increasing amount of money being spent on military hardware across Europe means less money there is to adapt to the particular climate over here. So, essentially, what we have is, in one case, you have climate affecting geopolitics, and of course, geopolitics affecting climate. That's what we call a feedback loop, each one making the other one worse. And that's not the end. Right? I'm sorry this is turning out to be a peculiarly gloomy lecture. But unfortunately, that is the world we live in today. Right? Now, I want you to take you to a different point here, and this is something which is impossible to predict, because there is actually no completely scientific consensus here, so I want to be a little careful here. But climate scientists have identified what they call tipping points. Right? These are basically thresholds in the climate system beyond which the change becomes self-reinforcing. Right? Let me give you some examples. Again, caveat that scientists disagree on how close we are to these tipping points, but examples will be the ice sheet collapse, right, in Greenland or the West Antarctic. What happened? The sea levels jump all over the world. Right? It's not a gradual, 1 centimeter a year. Suddenly, the water jumps by 10 feet. Or the Amazon rainforest dryback. The more you cut into the Amazon forest, the more carbon is released. The weather is disrupted, but here's the interesting point. Beyond a certain level, there is no way for it to recover. It becomes savanna, and that savanna does not have the same carbon absorption capacity as the rainforest. In the permafrost in Siberia, if that thaws, we have massive releases of methane buried under the permafrost, which means suddenly global warming accelerates. The Atlantic circulation slowdown means Europe's climate shifts. We think we are actually peculiarly blessed, mainly because Cambridge, for example, is the same latitude as Calgary in Canada. Calgary goes down to minus 40 degrees centigrade in winter. We rarely have snow. That's because of the mid-Atlantic ocean current. If that stops or slows down, the entirety of Europe can go into a deep freeze. We're not ready for that at all. Right? Or coral reefs. Right? If you have basically the coral reefs die out, you have fisheries collapsing across the tropics. In fact, there's a huge number of areas where you see these things, tipping points might be happening, and how you can see that these will feed on each other in some way. Why does this matter for our argument? Well, again, the key point is the tipping points can trigger sudden, widespread, and correlated impacts on weather systems. Right? And this is not gradual change. It is a step change from here to here. It's affecting multiple regions at the same time. Let me take you a simple example. This is from the Washington Post about a week ago. And it's talking about how global temperatures have been rising for decades, but let me show you how this happened. So if you look at this graph on the right-hand side, what you see is the number of years in which you see is warmer than average and cooler than average. And I want you to look at the averages themselves, not at the dots, but the averages, the slope of that curve. What you see is, over time, it starts out at that level, and as we move up there from the beginning, initially, you can see the red dot, and it's moving up faster and faster. Right? This is happening right now. So the speed with which these events are happening is already happening. All right, can we fix this? Well, the problem is we don't know what to do. Right? In some cases, this is called geoengineering, and it has side effects we did not even imagine. Let's start with sulfur. Right? The sulfur story is very straightforward. Turns out burning coal and ship fuel basically releases sulfur dioxide. Right? Now, is this good news or is this bad news? Sulfur dioxide is a form of pollution, which is pretty terrible for most of our lungs. So would you say good news or bad news? Right? We would say pretty much, most of us, probably bad news. Right? So good idea to replace the coal and the ship fuel with cleaner forms of energy. The problem is the sulfur particles reflect sunlight, which has a cooling effect. And so for decades, pollution was accidentally masking the warming effect which was happening. So we cleaned up. The International Maritime Organization in 2020, according to the agreement, it turns out there were strict new limits on the amount of sulfur you could use in ship fuel. What happened? Well, shipping sulfur emissions were cut by 80%. Right? You can see that on this graph here. This is the level of sulfur emissions dropping dramatically after 2020. Great. Unfortunately, that reduced that air pollution from shipping. And you can see where the air pollution is getting really low. That's exactly in the sea lanes where the ships congregate. Right? So you can see here on the coast of Africa, on the coast of Good Hope, all over near Europe, and so on and so forth. Anyway, turns out China also introduced clean air policies to reduce coal pollution. This is a public health victory, right? There were a few respiratory deaths, people were able to breathe more, but the catch, of course, was we removed the accidental sunshade. Right? It was keeping us cooler than it would have otherwise, and some scientists link this to the 2023-24 ocean heat spike. You can see that's what, if without that, it would have gone normally, but now this spike is pushing it up. This is some estimates that we have permanently increased the speed of warming because of that. So essentially, we solved one problem, but we accelerated another. Okay, and the second problem is that not everybody loses from climate change. Right? Think about Russia. Right? You've got new farmland, you have new Arctic shipping routes, you have accessible oil and gas. Climate change may be great for Russia. Right? Think about Canada. Longer growing seasons, more resource access, probably good. Maybe Scandinavia, milder winters maybe, or colder, we don't know. Or new agricultural zones, this is all good stuff for them. But that creates problems, right? If you think about climate negotiations, why would a country that is benefiting from these things actually say, hey, why would we want emissions cuts? You want more emissions because this is helping your country, but it's not, the other countries are being hurt, but it's not in my interest if I was Russian or Canadian to support any kind of reduction in the level of emissions. And now let's suppose we add intentional geoengineering to the picture. What that means is countries or individuals take it upon themselves to go ahead and geoengineer the climate. Right? The most discussed form over here is something called solar radiation management. What that means is we directly inject sulfur particles into the stratosphere to reflect the sunlight. Essentially, you're doing deliberately what that sulfur pollution we talked about earlier is doing accidentally. In theory, this would be great, right? This would cool the planet quickly. You're injecting it right into the stratosphere. It's too high for us to notice, but it's bring the temperature down. And the problem is it will not do so everywhere around the world. It does so unevenly. What that means is if you have one nation solution, that's another one's drought, right? So for example, models basically suggest that solar geoengineering can reduce temperatures in some regions, but disrupt monsoon patterns in India, for example, right? So if you're benefiting from cooling, but your neighbor is now suffering from droughts which they didn't have before, they're not going to be extremely happy. And here's the really troubling part, right? There is no global governance framework for this. That means, in other words, if nothing stops a country, or even somebody very wealthy, from saying, hey, I want to do this by myself, set up a cannon, shoot sulfur straight in the atmosphere, there is nothing stopping them from doing this. It's not very expensive either. It wouldn't require an Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos to do this. It would just be something like the order of about 100 million pounds, which is absolutely nothing for the billionaires, right? So if you're facing a climate catastrophe, you might decide to act unilaterally, regardless of what happens to other people, right? And that brings us back to our theme, right? This is another source of correlated risk, right? If a major kind of geoengineering project you've done goes wrong, you have sudden global disruption. And it's not gradual. It's going to happen all at once. Right? There is a very good book, which I recommend. It's fiction, but it's a very good book called Termination Shock by Neil Stephenson, which is exactly about this, about basically a very rich individual deciding to take it on himself to launch sulfur into the stratosphere to reduce temperatures everywhere. And it turns out the Indians are not particularly happy about this because their monsoons are getting disrupted. So it evolves into a case when the Indian commandos are trying to take this guy down, but other countries are trying to protect this guy. And so it is quite an interesting book. Very thick, 600 pages or so, I believe. Okay. All right. So what we have talked about so far, the takeaway is simple. The climate and the geopolitics basically amplify each other, right? So if you're a drought in Europe, you have less hydroelectric power, which means more gas demand. If you have a heat wave, you need more air conditioning, creates an electricity price spike, right? So, and if you put that, this is just climate, but if you put that during a geopolitical crisis, the effects are multiplying. So take summer of 22, right? Europe was trying to wean itself off Russian gas. Okay? Simultaneously, it had a record heat wave and a drought at the same time. Turns out that French nuclear plants had to reduce their output. Why? Because the river was too warm to cool them. Simultaneously, the Rhine, levels of the Rhine were too low for barges to transport coal to German plants. So essentially, every shock was reinforcing every other shock. It was not just that they were happening together, they were pushing each other along. They were happening in the same direction. So how do insurers react to this? Well, when their correlated losses basically exceed the level of capacity they have, what can they do? Well, number one, they can raise their prices. Premiums, that's why we see those premiums going up 50 to 100%, some cases 300%. You've never done anything wrong. You haven't done anything different. But your premiums go up because the buffers are not big enough, right? Second, you can restrict coverage. Excesses of 5,000 pounds or 10,000 pounds, you cannot claim if the damage to your house is less than 10,000. Or exit entirely. There's no price, there are no terms. I'm sorry, I'm not insuring you. Right? We've seen all these three happening together, right? So in some areas of the UK, we have seen all these three things happening. So this is what I call a doom loop. Right? Without insurance, how do you borrow money to buy a house? Mortgages become impossible. Without mortgages, you can't sell your property. Who's going to buy your property if they can't have money to buy your property? And without buyers, property values collapse. Right? So if you think about the Hendersons, our first example in the beginning, the nest egg completely evaporates. And that's not because the house was damaged, but because the market for insuring houses disappeared under them. Okay. And again, for people outside the UK watching online, this is not just the UK. Right? If you're watching from Canada, or if you're watching from California or Australia, you've seen this movie already. Right? So in California, entire towns have become uninsurable. Here's an example. Right? So insurance companies, so you can see the wildfires taking off, for example, in this particular state over here in California. The town is called, ironically, called Paradise, California. And in the 5 years since this town was ravaged by a wildfire, their homeowner insurance has gone up dramatically, and now basically 7 of the 12 insurers in that state have said, we are not going to insure you. Right? Or if they, in some cases, if they do insure you, your premium is 10 times what it was the previous year. Right? So, and again, in California, they have a state-run plan. Basically, the government insures you. And unfortunately, it promised insurance relief, but there were lots of loopholes. So what were some of those loopholes? The promise was that the insurers would have to write policies in fire-prone areas at a rate at least equal to 85% of the market share across the state. So what do these guys do? Is basically figure out 85% is the average. So what you do is, in areas which are fire-prone, you don't offer any new policies. You offer lots of policies which people don't necessarily need in areas which are much safer. Right? So you see the distressed counties over here, that's where there's no insurance being offered. Because the state, it's a statewide insurance plan, 85% across the state. And this, in LA, it was the other way around. It turns out in many cases, the insurer stopped covering them, and then the fire happened, and then they lost everything, right? Because they're no longer covered by that. In Australia, some postcodes face premium, which is above their average annual income. So these are examples of how much they've grown all over Australia. Right? Again, as I said, this is not a British problem. It is a global problem. Right? Go back to the UK energy markets. The UK basically was a real-time experiment, right, in correlated failure. Before autumn 2021, there were 70 suppliers competing across the British market. Right? By February 22, 30 had gone bust. Right? So essentially, we went from a very competitive market to an oligopoly in less than 6 months. The problem is the cost did not disappear. Somebody had to bear the cost. So who paid? Well, if you're the failed supplier customers, you're transferred to a different supplier, a supplier of last resort. As I pointed out in this graph, you keep getting moved from supplier to supplier. Right? So unfortunately, the new supplier you're transferred to has to buy energy at current prices because they were not set up. They hadn't hedged. These are new customers coming in. So in order to give you a contract, I have to buy energy at the current price and sell it to you with a markup. So that means someone has to cover the gap. Who covers the gap? Right? There's a gap between the old price and the new price, and the answer turns out to be all of us. So in other words, every household in Britain is paying about £100 a year extra to cover the collapse of suppliers, which we have never used. So even if you didn't use any of those suppliers, your electricity bill, your gas bills are still higher, mainly because somebody has to cover those costs. Okay, so if you look at the average UK energy bill, in early 2021, it was about £1,100. By 2022, it was £2,500. And there was a government price cap. They said, okay, we're trying to protect people, we'll impose a price cap. But again, somebody had to pay, so it goes straight to the government deficit. You have tens of billions in cost directly to the taxpayer, right? And so you have a direct impact, you have a supplier failure cost, and you have an intervention cost. So what's a common pattern in all of this? Right? First, those correlated losses overwhelm the thin buffers you're talking about. Those costs are transferred to households and taxpayers. Right? The private companies basically failed or they retreated, and the costs became to the other households or taxpayers in the form of higher prices, reduced service, direct bailouts. Right? So to put that in a different way, during normal times, the profits went to the shareholders, but in correlated times, that comes to the public. So what can we do? Well, the first line of defense is straightforward, right? Have less to lose. What does that mean? Well, think about flooding. Right? The biggest thing is stop building in floodplains. Right? The UK approved 5,000 new homes in high-risk areas last year. Right? And if you do have a house in a floodplain, better defenses for those. There are grants given by FloodRay for flood doors, air brick covers, non-return walls. You need to put those into place because, in the end of the day, it's not clear that your insurance company will end up paying if your house actually gets damaged. Right? Okay, let's go about what about energy? Well, things you can do to make it less to lose is straightforward. Insulation, heat pumps, better building standards, right? The UK has some of the oldest, most leaky housing in the entirety of Europe. And that basically means that every retrofit you need is one less house exposed to the next gas spike. Right? And of course, we need to use tools which are more designed for these correlation patterns I'm talking about. For example, one example is something called parametric insurance. Parametric insurance works very, very differently from regular insurance. What that means is there's a trigger, and you pay on the trigger. That means the level of the river or the wind speed or whatever. It's not on your assessed damage. And because I don't have to look at your home, it's fast. It doesn't take months. There are no disputes. There's no adjusters, nothing. So examples in the UK, for example, a company called Flood Flash apparently pays parametric insurance on UK storms. Right? Now, of course, that means essentially what you have in this case, in the traditional insurance pattern, you have an event, there's an assessment by an insurer. The insurer then basically says, okay, we're going to pay this much. You say, no, you need me to pay more. You need to pay more, so there's a dispute, and eventually there's a payout months later. With parametric insurance, the event happens, the data triggers the insurance, and the payout happens. Right? And it has been used several years. For example, Caribbean countries use that for hurricane damage. Right? The problem, of course, is you don't necessarily get what your house is worth. Right? I mean, it is a fixed amount. So if you have a house which is particularly expensive, parametric insurance is not going to cover you. I mean, it will give you based on what they think is the level of damage, not upon what your house actually suffered. The second thing is something called catastrophe bonds. And the idea here is these are bonds which are sold to investors because with a very high interest rate. The key is if a disaster happens, you don't pay the coupons to the investors. You use that money to pay back the people whose houses have been affected. Basically, you have transferred your correlated risk from individual insurers to the capital markets, and the idea is that capital market can, absorb that risk better than a traditional insurance balance sheet, because these guys are widely diversified. So what you have is something like this. You have a catastrophe. If you don't have a catastrophe, not a problem, you get a high interest rate. You have a catastrophe, you get nothing back. And a lot of individual companies use this as well. For example, Tokyo Disneyland use this in case there's an earthquake near the park. If you don't have an earthquake near the park, you get a high interest rate. Earthquake near the park, you get nothing back. All money's gone. Of course, the problem here is, if you think about situations here, now you're dealing with how do I prove this event happened or not? So, for example, the World Bank issued pandemic bonds during COVID. And the idea was that if they didn't know COVID was coming, this was issued well before COVID, but there were other disasters, Ebola, all these other diseases have been going around, and they said, okay, you know what, we will design a bond which will give you a high interest rate, but if a major health disaster happens, we will not pay you back. We'll use that money to help the people in the countries which are affected by this. It worked great, except during COVID. Why? Because the whole point was you have to fulfill a certain number of triggers. Just like we talked about parametric insurance, you had triggers. You had so many deaths in a country, so many has to cross a border, things like that. Problem is, COVID was too fast moving. So by the time all the triggers are finished, 1 million people have already died. So by the time the money gets to the countries that actually need it, yeah, tough luck, right? The good news is, for the capital markets, cat bonds have been doing extremely well. So if you buy a cat bond, and no catastrophe happens, you get extremely high returns. The downside is it's becoming a lot more difficult to predict when the catastrophe will happen because of all the correlations I'm talking about. So yeah, high risk, possibly high returns. Right? But we can go back and talk more about the public backstops. For example, the UK's flood rate system basically pools flood risk across all home insurers. And so every household policy has a levy put on it. So the high-risk properties get affordable insurance, and the risk is spread across the entire market. The limitations here are simple, right? There are no commercial properties allowed, no new builds, and it ends in 2039. But it kind of shows that markets and the government together might be able to handle what the markets alone can't. So this is kind of like a public backstop behind the insurance market. When energy, you can think of better risk sharing. For example, strategic gas reserves, like strategic oil reserves, right? You have long-term contracts with multiple suppliers, not just with one country. And you have better interconnection with your neighbors. So in other words, if gas prices rise in one country, you can get it from a different country, wind power. This is a problem with Europe. It's very difficult to transport, for example, electricity from Spain to Germany, mainly because of these issues. If this works better, one country's shortage is offset by another country's surplus. Right? The EU is trying to do some of this together by buying gas together so that individual countries are not actually picked off by sellers. Anyway, the problem is, at the end of the day, there is a pricing dilemma. Right? If we price risk too cheaply, what happens? Well, people build in flood chains. Right? Or if you have cheap energy, you don't need to actually insulate your house. Energy is pretty cheap. But the problem is, if you have accurate prices, prices that affect that level, reflect the level of correlated risk, what does that mean? The people who can't afford it are hit the highest. Right? I mean, you can't afford this stuff. And it's not your fault that you were allowed to build in a floodplain. And for example, the Hendersons in that first example did not choose a riskier climate. It was basically climate change found them. So another way around this might be maybe real prices, but targeted support. So for example, don't say, this is the price. Don't fix the price. Use the actual price, but give money to the people who cannot afford it. Right? So risk-based premium, grants from flood resilience, grants for fund location, basically cost-reflective tariffs, and so on and so forth. Right? So blunt price caps protect everybody, even those who don't need it. Right? And they will not encourage efficiency. So targeted support basically costs less and works better. Another thing what you need is lots more data. Right? And this is an unfortunate issue because a lot of countries are cutting back on their data collection. And we need it more than ever. For flooding, the risk map based on historical data are completely useless. It doesn't matter what the risk map tells you. What's happening today is not like what happened in the past. We need forward-looking models. Energy, market monitoring to catch that building stress earlier. Right? Ofgem could have seen that supplier crisis coming. The signs were there months before the first collapse, but they didn't. Right? So these early warning systems basically buy time for some kind of preparation, but we are not doing much of that already. So what's the choice ahead? Well, the problem here is the examples I started with in the beginning, the Hendersons and the Patels, they're not victims of random misfortune. Right? they were experiencing basically a predictable consequence of how we have structured markets for risks, but are becoming more correlated now. Right? So let me leave you with this. We have two choices. Right? The first path is pretend the old world still exists. What's the old world? Independent risk, thin buffers, the markets handle everything. Right? The results are going to be that more households will lose insurance, more suppliers are going to collapse, there are going to be more bailouts. The second path is we need to acknowledge that correlated risks require very different tools from the old world. Right? We need more capital, more different types of structures. We need public backstops. We need more honest pricing with targeted support. So, right at the end, do I close on a hopeful note? Not really. So, a comfortable middle ground, which we have taken for granted for over 150 years, doesn't exist. Right? That was cheap insurance, cheap energy, no government involvement. That was never existed. It was an illusion because the shocks were mild. They were not correlated. They were independent. Unfortunately, both climate and geopolitical risk have ended that period. Right? So, the question is not whether we will pay for correlated risk. We are already paying. The question is, do we need chaotic failures or bailouts, or should we have some kind of deliberate system that spreads the cost fairly across our new world? Right? That is a challenge we face. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I was listening from next door, and one term came to my head. You're like the smiling assassin. You deliver very dark news and information, but always with a smile. And I don't know whether that makes it easier to digest. But yeah, thank you very much. I wanted to also make you aware of a lecture that might be of interest, which is partially linked to yours. So if you would like to know more about the environmental aspect of your lecture, our current professor of the environment, Professor Helen Jersky, she did a lecture on the 22nd of January called An Ocean of Air. So if you'd like to delve more into that aspect of your lecture, you can kind of watch them online. So we've put this online already. Time for questions. So either online, I've got two questions here already online, but is there anyone in the hall who would like to kickstart the questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. That was really interesting talk, and I like the way you sort of build that up, sort of starting with insurance and going through. I think, well, in some respects, obviously, some of the challenges are more. We could talk about food. We could talk about food shocks as another thing, and the biodiversity crisis sits on top. What I'm interested in, actually, I think you're also saying that we need to move away from the whole idea of the way that we've regulated natural monopolies, the utilities, the other sides, because you're essentially saying that pricing and thin buffers is not a way. Do we need to actually maintain a more normal level of prices and actually start reserving, not at the companies, because otherwise we always, if we do that, I think we risk privatizing the profits, which goes to shareholders, and then have public bailouts. But where do you see that sort of regulatory framework shifting to, if we're not relying on competition, which has been the bedrock of privatization of natural assets since, the 1980s?
That is a very good question. And there's no clear answer to that. The major problem is, number one, governments don't have the money to do this completely by themselves, right? Somebody has to pay for everything. So if you're doing this with a nationalized company, what you would end up with is very high prices or very high deficits, which we're going to pay for with our taxes. Private companies generally do a good job, but the problem is the buffers which are being kept historically by these private companies to handle disasters like this have not been meant for this new world we are in. So my personal sense is the best thing to do would be to continue with the private companies, but have a public backstop. So in other words, you only step in before the actual failure happens, right? And we've done this in banking for quite some time, and it's the same issue in banking as well. Correlated risk. People think of the global financial crisis. Everybody's houses went under around the same period of time, but the point is that if you impose kind of an insurance policy on the insurance companies, then they're paying a premium, which in turn is kept as a buffer to bail out those guys. So in other words, you have a private pricing still, but you have that public levy on those companies to keep, hopefully, them alive. Right? We don't want them completely bailed out because that creates a moral hazard problem.
There's a kind of related question online from Haley. Will the industry move towards a future where insurance is only for the wealthy, while the rest of us are left to fund our own disaster recovery?
That is a very scary question. The way I talk about it at the end is, if you indeed let prices completely float, and it goes back to your question as well, if you let prices completely float, it becomes unaffordable, right? Because this is too expensive for any individual to support. So yes, the answer to that question would be, indeed, okay, if you let complete private insurance, it'd be for the wealthy, not for anyone else. But if you have a price cap, the wealthy benefit much more than we do, right? So I would probably say the idea would be more about don't have a price cap, have real prices, but then pay taxpayers with the lower levels of income, give them targeted price support.
I mean, it's interesting. I think today there was in several newspapers this story of where will we build new houses? So housing targets, house building targets, and the link to building on floodplains, or not just now, but future flood areas. And it seems that the person who would like to have their own home, build their own home, has little choice where they can build, at least in this country. It might be different in other countries, so it's quite pertinent to have the lecture tonight. Do we have one more question? Can we go here at the front, please? Thank you. So I'm mindful of the time. That might have to be our last question. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's clear to me that there needs to be some kind of change at quite a widespread level. I'm curious, who do you think is best placed to spearhead that change? Is it governments, multilateral institutions, is it corporates, or is it the insurance companies themselves? And what do you think is going to be the tipping point to make people start pursuing that change in earnest?
Yeah, these are all very good questions, and I'm afraid I don't have a very good answer for you. The major problem essentially is there's not just only losers from any of these things, right? And the winners from all these things we are seeing will oppose any kind of action being taken. And so if you have, for example, think about governments, they're not going to be agreeing on a common framework, right? And it's easy to see an individual country taking unilateral action, right, against something. I think the biggest problem we have is this lack of information on how these risks are all happening together. So I may say a little self-serving here, but it's more about educating, and I think us as individuals talking to our politicians to say this is really important to us is important. Most of us think we're individuals. We really can't affect big policy. That's not true. Right? I mean, you definitely can make your voices heard, and I would highly encourage you to do so. I mean, write to your MP, right? You know, these are important questions.
Thank you so much for the lecture tonight. I'm so glad we could entice you back to Gresham College, and I hope there will be many more lectures by you here. Thank you so much indeed, and thank you for coming.